for those of you who are unaware, the new formula of Mr. Mark Setter, and I'm assuming Mr. Mark Softer too, is a lot more aggressive than what you might be used to using in the past. It does have a disclaimer on the actual bottle that this will dissolve water-based paint. Now, a lot of people who heard about the new consistency were a little concerned about it, and I mean, I can see why, but the moment I heard about how it will attack paint, the first thing I thought of is that it can be used as like chipping solution, because before, if I wanted to achieve like the maximum amount of paint chipping and just paint discoloration. Hello everybody, really glad you could make it here today. So if you couldn't tell already, today we're going to be talking about the new Mr. Mark Setter and its implications on my personal favorite step of weathering, chipping. But not just any kind of chipping, physical chipping where I actually chip up my paint coat. So if you're unaware of the current situation, let me bring you up to speed. So a couple of months ago, Mr. Hobby released a new formula for Mr. Mark Setter and Mr. Mark Softer, but we're not talking about Mr. Mark Softer today. Mr. Mark Setter is basically decal glue for use in water slide decals, and the new formula is much more aggressive than the old one. It can actually wear away water-based acrylic, which can be a bit of a problem, especially since Mr. Hobby Aqueous, their more popular painting line, is water-based acrylic. However, if you're like me, you can use it to your advantage in the weathering process. And I talked about this in my lubers video, but I rarely get the chance to really experiment because I've been in this hobby for a long enough time to know what I want and to know how to best achieve the look I want as quickly as possible. So unless I'm actively setting out to do something different, I don't experiment that much. However, if I get the chance to try out a new technique or a new product, all while in the same service of that weathered style that I have come to enjoy, it is even better. But let's see how this stuff works. And to go on a bit of a tangent before we get into the main topic of today's video, yes, I realize that physical chipping is so fine, it doesn't really show up both on camera and in person, especially when you put further weathering effects on top of it. But here's the thing. I came into the world of Gunpla from scale models, and a big component about those kinds of model building is reality in scale. Making sure your weathering effects are in scale to the subject you're working on. Because here's the thing. Although sponge and brush chipping are really nice and they're really easy, especially for a beginner to learn, if you were to shrink down a real-life mobile suit to the size of a high grade, how much of that super stark sponge chipping would actually be seen? Just something I put out there. I know a lot of people like sponge chipping, but it's something I've never got the chance to really talk about, but I figured I'd talk about it since this video is about chipping. Here's how chipping with Mark Setter looks on a somewhat familiar kit. This Zaku has a combination of Mark Setter chipping as well as my usual physical chipping with a hobby knife and tweezers, and was actually where I tried out Mark Setter chipping for the first time. Kind of scary, especially since I only have one of the Speed Bandai kit, which I'm entering into a competition. Although I like how it turned out, I think we can definitely improve. Alright, so we are ready to start working. The setup is very, very simple, even simpler than my usual painting one. We have 3 things here, 4 I guess if we're counting the subject, and that is the Mark Setter itself, a cup of water, paintbrush, and then the kit. I want to talk a little about the paintbrush I'm using specifically because in terms of supplies, this is going to be the only one that varies, the other one of course being what you're chipping, and as you can see, the brush is a number 4 and it is a chisel blender. I have chosen this one due to it being very short and kind of a scrubbier brush. It's very similar to the brushes I've used for oil paint weathering. Ideally for chipping, this brush should be a little bit more frayed so I can use the irregularities in it to aid in the chipping. I do have brushes like that. However, I use those for oil weathering and they are coated with oil paint, not ideal for what we're doing today. So as I use this brush more, it will get better, but right now, this is what we've got. To start, I'll get the mark setter and just get the majority off of it on the brush. We don't want too much on. And then we're just gonna brush this all over. I mainly want to concentrate this chipping on areas that people would touch when removing the armor panel. So mainly places like there. I'll get my brush into a little water and then just keep scrubbing it. And as you keep doing this, you'll remove paint. You can kind of see as I clean the brush on my thumb there. If you have to, keep adding it. I'll do so, and then keep scrubbing. You'll probably figure this out just by seeing all this footage play out, but this process is one that you have to constantly work at. It doesn't happen as quickly as my usual physical chipping, mainly due to the setter having to actually soak into the paint to dissolve it. This could have gone faster if I didn't have as many coats of paint on this kit, but I chose to repaint it since I didn't like the original color I had. There's like 6 coats total. It's why you'll see a slightly darker layer of paint surrounding some of the chipping, or you might not, but trust me, it's there. This is also due to me not totally swamping the paintwork in the mark setter, which is something I learned when I used it on that Zaku. If you let too much setter dry, it leaves behind this white residue, which is nearly impossible to clean up. I did manage to, but it took a lot of work, with mark setter, mark softer, and water in no particular order. It was a massive pain, and I'm trying to avoid that, which is why I have the water to clean off the brush, and keep the amount of setter I'm introducing back to the paint to a minimum. That being said, that residue can also be used to your advantage in creating certain weathering types, the first one that comes to mind being faded effects or even rain streaks. But you are taking a pretty big chance while doing so, and this is coming from the guy who's using decal setter for paint chipping. I'm cleaning off the brush constantly. You can see it on my hand, that thinned out layer of paint that the brush removes. If I didn't, I would also be putting that thin layer back on the chips, which would blend out the effect too much and make the effect seem faded. I also learned this from the Zaku, and I don't want it to happen a second time. But that could be an added bonus, making the paint chips themselves look weathered like they've been there for a while. The decision on whether or not to have this look is definitely case by case, but it is something handy to keep in mind. I think that I'd rather keep the chipping seen, since you can always add a filter to create that faded appearance later on. Here's how the chipping actually looks. I know that it doesn't really come across on video, at least for now, but it's a great effect and ties perfectly into my workflow, using a perceived issue and playing it to my advantage. I like making my materials work for me, and this definitely does. Now, let's finish things up. Although I like the chipping so far, it does happen pretty slowly, so I tried combining it with my usual style. I start by brushing on the mark setter, use tweezers to chip along the edges and other areas I want to expose the metallic, then use the brush to remove the top layer of paint, and slightly blend the chipping into a large chipping area, instead of lots of tiny scratches. Compared to using just a brush, this method has more definition. I can create more kinds of shapes instead of the rounded gentle worn effect with just a brush, but I think the result would be different and honestly better if I had better brushes that were more frayed and irregular and also really stiff. The brush I was using is honestly too soft to be effective, but it does blend out the chipping kinda nicely. The tweezers are also important. The ones I'm using are a really old pair with a bent tip. If I had my usual pair, which is in a lot better condition, I think the super sharp pointed tip would only create fine scratches. Because the tweezers are blunt, they create larger areas of chipping, and I can use the blunt tip to create different shapes by hitting the paint at different angles. In the intro, I described how Mr. Mark Softer also has a new formula, which I did test out. While you could use that instead, it just doesn't work as well. It might work better for chipping Mr. Hobby Aqueous, but not so much for Vallejo, which I use pretty much exclusively. Just thought I'd mention it since I think I might get questions about it. Also, since I'm talking about materials, the Mark Setter works as intended, only dissolving acrylic. The Tamiya lacquer metallic underneath remains untouched. I thought I should introduce the kit, better late than never, right? It's the 1/12 scale Noseru from Kotobukiya's Marutoys lineup, which makes this not only the first non-Gunpla kit on the channel, but also the first non-Bandai kit on the channel. And I'm not counting those old armor videos I still keep for some reason. I was actually planning on doing a video on a Make or Patlabor kit for the first non-Gunpla video, or maybe even the Tachikoma from Ghost in the Shell, but this is how things turned out. I'm not complaining though. I love this adorable little scooter guy, and it's got more to it than even I first thought, with a completely detailed inner frame. This is probably my favorite non-Gunpla mecha kit, and the channel will be seeing this in a video sometime in the future, complete with a small base, just when I'm not filming two different build series at the same time. I do want to cover more non-Gunpla mecha just to branch out. It definitely won't be the norm, but you will see these kinds of kits more. Here's how the chipping looks. I'm super impressed. Although I really enjoy my usual method of physical chipping with a hobby knife and tweezers, I was definitely limited with the shapes of chipping I could achieve. This rounds out my collection and gives me a result that in some cases is pretty comparable to sponge chipping, at least in my opinion. But seeing how the chipping looks is one thing. I want to see how it looks under weathering because that'll be a bit more interesting. And unlike the usual high-grade builds you're used to seeing on the channel, the larger scale means I can incorporate more kinds of weathering because those would actually translate. It's also why the chipping is much larger on this build. I'm keeping this pretty subdued though. It's just a patina, which you've seen me apply like 10,000 times, and some dust work with pigments. I will then seal everything with Mr. Super Clear Flat. Here it is. I should be focusing on that Cerulean project series, but I really wanted to talk about this and put out a video on it before my massive video backlog makes me forget. It's a topic that I haven't heard a lot of people talk about, other than how the newer Mark Setter is a problem for them. This kit is going to be entered in an upcoming competition too, so it's not like I started an entirely new build just for a video. If you like that sweet realistic chipping, I highly encourage you to try this stuff out. And if you find the idea of physically chipping your preciously applied paintwork kind of intimidating, I don't blame you. It's definitely a little extreme, but I definitely like it. As usual, thank you for watching, and I'll be seeing you in the next video, whenever that is.